Six Flags New Orleans. The New Orleans amusement park Jazzland opened in 2000, and the lease was purchased by Six Flags in 2002. The park was upgraded a year later and renamed Six Flags New Orleans with a Mardi Gras-themed area and a respectable collection of rides and coasters. In 2005, a storm struck the area, a big one. Long story short, the wreck of this once merry place has sat deserted for many, many years since Katrina struck, and is now owned by the city with tentative plans to put a mall in its place. If you're willing to risk the arrest for trespassing, it can serve as a hell of a creepy urban exploration outing. Danvers State Insane Asylum. Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts is old enough to have been known by several other names, including State Lunatic Hospital and the Danvers Lunatic Asylum. In its most crowded period during the 1920s and 30s, there were controversies over its rumored use of shock therapy, drugs, and frontal lobotomies, a procedure that may well have been pioneered there. Since its closure in 1992, it has fallen into a state of severe creepiness. It was the setting for the excellent 2001 horror film Session 9, and it did a lot of the heavy lifting in generating a truly dreadful and terrifying atmosphere. While there have been some efforts made to renovate the area, the spirits have not been kind. In 2006, some structures were demolished and apartment buildings put in their place. But then in April 2007, all of these buildings and several construction trailers went up in flames. Any efforts at renovation since then have largely stalled. The domes. Most locals don't know who built these giant concrete saucer-shaped domes out in the middle of the Arizona desert or why they were constructed. Visitors to the site are known to come down with a case of the willies in about 4 seconds. The extreme neglect, the oddness of the architecture, and the vibe or energy of the place as the sun goes down combine to give one a healthy sense of unease. While they may look like 1950s-era flying saucers, they were in fact built in 1982 by an electronics company. Their weird design was supposedly to assist with insulation, but make them cheaper to construct. The company failed in 1983, and contaminated groundwater was found at the site shortly thereafter, so cleanup was not exactly a priority for the now bank-owned properties. New owners acquired the site in 2006, and there it still sits, spooky, deserted, and forever raising the question, who would pay for this? Holy Land, USA. Holy Land, USA was once an 18-acre theme park in Waterbury, Connecticut. At its peak in the 1960s and 1970s, it saw upwards of 40,000 visitors per year. It was closed for renovation in 1984, and its owner John Greco died in 1986, so no one's been sure what to do with it since. The property has been watched over by a group of nuns in the intervening decades while it deteriorates further and further and becomes more disturbing. As if the crumbling statues, dark and still structures, and obvious vandalism don't frighten you enough, there's also the fact that a teenager was murdered on these deserted grounds in 2010. While police reports have shown instances of trespassing have dropped, that really just means there are fewer people around, making the place even more isolated and terrifying. Oradour. Just down the road from the village of Oradour-sur-Glane, in France, there lies the original village of Oradour-sur-Glane, or what's left of it. On June 10, 1944, the village had the extreme bad fortune of being confused with nearby Oradour-sur-Vires by a Nazi panzer unit, which erroneously believed that a Waffen SS officer was being held by the villagers there. The Nazis massacred 642 men, women, and children with incendiary devices and machine gun fire before the mistake was cleared up, and that was pretty much the entire population of the town. French President Charles de Gaulle ordered the town rebuilt, and it was, but he also ordered that the ruins of the old town should stay behind as a reminder, and so they did as well. A plaque roughly translating to, "so as not to forget," is the only modern addition to the town. Belitz Heilstatten Military Hospital. The former sanatorium southwest of Berlin was built to deal with an explosion of tuberculosis in the late 1800s and expanded twice throughout the next several decades. It was put to use as a military hospital during both World Wars and has doubtless seen more than its share of death, despair, and craziness. The hospital was under the control of the Soviet Union until the country ceased to exist in the early 90s and has stood empty since. Half-hearted attempts at restoration have played tug-of-war with plans to demolish the site, as over the years its creepiness factor has risen steadily with its level of decay. Urban explorers love this place, and it's also been used as the set for the film The Pianist and a Rammstein music video. Bangar, India. While the abandoned town of Bangar in the state of Rajasthan, India, has become something of a tourist attraction, you'll notice that there are no photos of it at night. That is because setting foot in the place at night is strictly forbidden, and apparently the Indian government is pretty serious about it. Even though government rules state that the Archaeological Survey of India must have an office at every historical site, and this is one, there is no office here. Tourists are let in during the daytime grudgingly, but the general attitude of the government seems to be, this is a great place to stay away from. Legend goes that a heartbroken magician cursed the place in the 16th century after being rejected by the kingdom's princess, and all who lived within it are cursed with death without the possibility of rebirth. A prominent sign outside the little town reads, "Entering the borders of Bangar after sunset is strictly prohibited," and while they do not explicitly promise paranormal activity, we generally think this rule is best followed. The suburbs of Lee Acres in Florida. The story of Lee Acres is sad and uniquely American. In the 1950s, businessman Gerald Gold and Lee Ratner, who got rich selling Decon rat poison, divided up a huge stretch of land in southern Florida, owned by Ratner, into tiny half-acre parcels that they then sold to northerners for low prices. At $10 down and $10 a month, it seemed like a bargain. However, there was no infrastructure in place, and very few houses were built. Many lots were resold when checks stopped coming in, and the place was still barren by the 80s. When the real estate boom of the late 90s began, however, hundreds of cheap, quick houses started flying up on those old lots that baby boomers had inherited from their gullible parents. Far too many houses to actually meet the demands to live there, and while the real estate bubble popped, the suburbs of Lee Acres became a veritable ghost town. There are many blocks with only 1 or 2 occupied houses, and many have none at all. Plants, flowers, and alligators rule over this vast, empty suburban skeleton. One can easily imagine that they are in an alternate universe where the Cold War turned out a bit differently. Discovery Hut. Discovery Hut is located in Antarctica, close to McMurdo Sound. It was built by the party of explorer Robert Falcon Scott during the Discovery Expedition of 1901 to 1904, which was the second time anyone had ever tried to explore the region. If the hut looks like it's in pretty good shape for being that old, it may be because it is pretty much frozen solid. Inside this incredibly drafty little hut, you'll find functionally useless equipment, 90-plus-year-old stores of seal carcasses, meat and blubber, snow, ice, and despair. The hut has served no real purpose for decades upon decades, and probably would have been completely lost to decay and neglect long ago if it didn't sit in the middle of a deep freeze. Anderlecht Veterinary School. The last remaining unrenovated building out of the 19 that used to make up a veterinary complex in Anderlecht, Brussels has stood deserted since the 1990s. We're thinking it will remain unrenovated because crews are just straight up terrified to even go near the place. Within its deserted, crumbling halls that lead to rooms that are full of more horrifying stuff than the last, including old hand-blown bottles of questionable fluids, syringes, and other old, rusty medical equipment. The main attractions are the animal heads and brains and assorted parts stuffed into jars throughout the building, in places appropriately called horror labs. Some parts are recognizable, some are not. Some are jammed together into larger jars, and some are sewn together that we absolutely do not want to know why. This is allegedly a fairly popular urban exploration destination, although anyone who wants to take a day trip to the horror labs is made of sterner stuff than we are. severe creepiness. It was the setting for the excellent 2001 horror film Session 9, and it did a lot of the heavy lifting in generating a truly dreadful and terrifying atmosphere. While there have been some efforts made to renovate the area, the spirits have not been kind. In 2006, some structures were demolished and apartment buildings put in their place. If you're willing to risk the arrest for trespassing, it can serve as a hell of a creepy urban exploration outing. Danvers State Insane Asylum. Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts is old enough to have been known by several other names, including State Lunatic named Six Flags New Orleans, with a Mardi Gras themed area and a respectable collection of rides and coasters. In 2005, a storm struck the area, a big one. Long story short, the wreck of this once merry place has sat deserted for many, many years since Katrina struck, and is now owned by the city with tentative plans to put a mall in its. Six Flags New Orleans. The New Orleans amusement park Jazzland opened in 2000, and the lease was purchased by Six Flags in 2002. The park was upgraded a year later and hospital and the Danvers Lunatic Asylum. In its most crowded period during the 1920s and 30s, there were controversies over its rumored use of shock therapy, drugs, and frontal lobotomies, a procedure that may well have been pioneered there. Since its closure in 1992, it has fallen into a state of